Great. Thank you very much for joining us, Nitin. Really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me. I know you guys are doing a lot of interesting things at State Street, and that you have a lot of thoughtful views because you've been in the blockchain industry for a while.
That's right.
And in the capital markets industry. So I'm just going to kind of jump into the questions and make sure we can get to all of them. So the first one I have is, you envision blockchains and tokenization playing a key role in capital markets. I'd be thrilled to hear what you're seeing now, and what led you to the idea that capital markets need tokenization and blockchains and things like that.
So first of all, thanks for the invitation. Love what you're doing with oracles and now proof of reserve, certainly very pertinent. So it's a story. I was working on payment tokenization 2011, 2012. So payment tokenization is what you have on your Apple device. Apple Pay is behind the scenes payment tokenization. I was leading the mobile payments for IBM at the time. I met like 65 different payment service providers around the world, and Bitcoin kept popping up as a disruptive force, but also in terms of what can we learn from the protocol. Came back to Austin, which is where I live, this is my hometown. 3 months, heads down, figured the whole thing out, and it clicked. Long story short, it's been good 12 plus years that I've been at this for some time. And I left IBM about a year and a half ago, where I was working on protocols, working on securities, consensus mechanisms, and everything else. Moved into understanding as to how we can modernize the existing financial system. So I joined one of the largest financial institutions in the world, which is where I work now, which is State Street. So fantastic journey. I just think that we viewed this, and I've written about this extensively, is there's a journey that the industry is going through at the moment, which is shifting to tokens, from where we were to digitizing the financial markets. And I believe for us to be able to take the next leap is shift from digitization to tokenization. And that is a massive shift, but it also solves a lot of problems that we've been talking about in the industry for quite some time.
Yeah, makes sense. I'm seeing a lot of that myself. I think it starts with tokenization because that's basically custody. And the thing that I've seen in DeFi, I think you and me we've been working on this for over a decade, more or less. Not necessarily DeFi because it didn't exist that long, but we've kind of seen the evolution. And I think tokenization is really the beginning. And once people have custody of assets, do you agree that then they move on to do things with them? Like they move on to make more advanced financial products? Is that what you think will happen next after people have custody of tokenized assets?
Let me take a step back, Sergey, because I think it's important for audience to understand how the existing financial systems work. We've heard this in media. We've had many of the officials talk about the fact that our system is digital. And I always refute the fact that if you're simply converting something into an Excel spreadsheet or PDF, it's not necessarily digital. And the narrative should be that instead of focusing on digital transformation, which has been the journey from the last 20 years, to move that focus to transforming digital. What do we expect from digital? And what we've seen in crypto and blockchain ecosystem is exactly that, those handshakes that we do between smart contracts, ability for me to be able to lock tokens, provide rules. These are all digital, the shift from digital transformation to transforming digital itself. And so from that perspective, our financial system is a fragment of various counterparties that helps us move the asset, that helps us do things like payments. So whenever you buy and sell an asset, it has to go through a series of things. And these have evolved over hundreds of years because of things like what we have seen with the recent past of last years of what I call contagion of incompetence, the FTX and so on and so forth. And so from that perspective, I think that the first step is to tokenize an asset. And I have broadly classified the industry into 3 I's, which is infrastructure, the rails, blockchain and DLT systems is the infrastructure that moves the asset, and then eventually tokenizing a asset. So what we've learned from crypto in the last 14 plus years is what will that world look like if we were to take an existing asset class, like your equities, your bonds, your ETFs, tokenize these assets? Can we adhere, because the tech is the same behind the scenes, can we then take these instruments, which is the second I, and use the same technology to move assets? At that point, you're achieving the efficiencies that we've been talking about the industry for quite some time. And the third I is data, which you cannot ignore, as you've talked about in your presentation, is there's a lot of data that goes into making decisions, whether it's opportunities, whether it's risk, whether it's compliance. So the third I is data, which is natural part of blockchain ecosystems. So these infrastructure, instruments, and data, to me, presents that amalgamated opportunity for us to modernize the existing financial system. And I'll say one more thing before I pause, is what's interesting to me is you have this, at its peak was $3 trillion, which is, today is like a little over $1 trillion in the crypto industry. And then you have the $471 trillion existing financial assets, give or take $1 trillion depending on the day.
Yeah, just give or take $1 trillion.
Give or take $1 trillion because the scale is huge. So the question then becomes when these things converge and it's using the same technology set, I think that's where it gets really interesting, I think.
Yeah, makes sense. You see what I mean, like with capital markets, give or take $1 trillion? It's like the whole industry we have right now.
It's true.
So it's quite a bit of money, or value. At the end of the day, I think if we get past the stage of custody where banks start making their own DeFi financial products, or banks and custodians, like you're seeing with some banks starting to make stable coins and so on.
Yeah.
Do you think that of that 471 trillion, a large percentage of it will be converted into the crypto format of these more advanced financial products?
So custody is a business activity, safekeeping of an asset, and there's a lot of functions that happen in the industry, things like collateral management, borrowing and lending, which are happening in our pools today. So AMMs and liquidity pools and lending pools are doing the same function. The notion of custody at that point, in our case, becomes asset locking mechanism, the surfacing of self-custody versus having a self-hosted versus a custodian-hosted wallet, and so on and so forth. So custody, the context of custody in traditional finance ties to the fact that we need a third party to keep the asset safe. So things like FTX Alameda don't happen, but you're keeping the custody and claiming a few things. And same thing with accounting. So somebody else custodying the asset, somebody else accounts for the asset. It's the investment manager that does the dealings. You have the broker-dealer in between, and that's a complex web of existing financial system. So custody is a small piece of it, but custody is central to the whole thing. So all this 471 trillion that I was talking about is custodies between all these global custodians that are actually keeping and they then become sort of the globally systemically important financial institution because they are now holding all these assets over time. And the question then becomes is, again, for you to have a sustainable functioning markets, you need to have faith in this market, both in terms of the fact that your transaction will go through. This is where you have talked about determinism and probabilistic models. So the industry has to be deterministic to say if the transaction actually happens, it will clear by the end of the day. And so to support that statement, you have to rely on all these market utilities that support that mechanism. And if we are aspiring to digitize and tokenize the world that we have today, you have to understand the flow of those utilities, the market incentives behind them, and who are you disrupting, what is the rent that you're taking away from the industry, and creating new intermediaries from that process. So there will be new intermediaries as you have seen. I'll pause here.
Yeah, makes sense. I think the global financial system has been kind of built on layer after layer of ideas.
Yep.
And there's ideas connected with other ideas that, on other ideas, and basically that creates this web of, as you call them, utilities, and they're sometimes known as market infrastructures, and they're sometimes known as rails, and so on and so on. I think that smart contracts provide an opportunity to rethink that architecture from the ground up, but I think that those utilities and market infrastructures still have a role to play. As long as they can provide their services in a cryptographically guaranteed form. So, one good example that I mentioned in my presentation was the LIBOR rate, which was manipulated, and that affected 300 trillion in assets and resulted in over 10 billion in fines.
Yep.
And that's an example of a very simple single piece of data that essentially, in your explanation, is a market utility that got manipulated. And then, the new version of the LIBOR rate isn't that much different, frankly. They increased the amount of banks, they changed a few things, they changed the person the entity that calculates the rate, but it's still open to the same possible manipulations. And so I think the thing that the cryptocurrency industry and the smart contract industry affords us is the ability to offer even those utilities a way to reinvent how they do things. So things become more reliable. Does that make sense?
No, it does to an extent, because look, I've been working with financial services pretty much all my career. we've been using cryptography for the longest time in financial services. It's a different type of cryptography, in the sense that we are protecting, again, accounts and information, and this goes into HSMs. So it's not new per se. I think it's the ecosystem and the transactional. So blockchain is a transaction system. Using cryptography where we have used in the past is a different context. We're simply using that for encryption, decryption, account management, and so on and so forth, versus applying cryptography for transaction system per se. And I think, to your point, the premise of any fraudulent activity, and that happens in crypto world as well, right? It all depends upon devising of a structure. So I'll give an example. All the rug pulls, hard and soft rug pulls that we've experienced, they're not code default. They were something that was injected and then actually transpired later on from a rug pull perspective. And any of the code sort of analysis wouldn't have gone in that model. So I think what you're saying makes sense, and I think taking the notion of smart contracts, which to me applies as a business logic on this transaction system, makes sense, and those become digital intermediaries of sorts in this newer world that we're envisioning. And how do we ensure that there is governance of those digital intermediaries, that they're not doing rug pulls, they're not involved in themselves in ascertaining the movement of asset and ensuring that the right rules of engagement are followed, for instance.
Right, and that all the utilities and all the systems that are powering them also meet that standard, because you need to meet that standard for both the contract and the utilities powering the contract.
Correct.
So you can't have something like a LIBOR in this new system.
Correct.
Great, makes sense. There's a few other categories of things that I'm interested to hear your views on, among many others, is cross-chain. So do you see a world where there will be multiple chains in the traditional capital markets? You know, there will be a chain for one custodian, another bank counterparty, a chain for a clearing and settlement system, and then all those chains will have to interact with each other in a cross-chain system. They'll have to communicate, they'll have to send events to each other. Do you view that as a big part of the puzzle?
I absolutely do. And I think what's interesting is when we were having this blockchain labs in IBM and we're looking into this, of course we are serving the world's 90% of the world's banks. We came up with this whole notion of permissioned blockchain. So that is us guys, and now it's karma that now I'm having to deal with permission versus private blockchain, which is basically the public versus permission blockchain that we are. So let's look at this, right? So day in, day out, I'm dealing with investment managers who have, and every financial institution has some blockchain work, whether it's happening in an incubated project inside or you're dealing with some public blockchain, which is what we've seen the Project Guardian. So if you look at Project Guardian, it's a brilliant project, MAS Singapore, where you have 3 financial institutions who are trying to be able to use the same protocols, Aave and Uniswap, to be able to bring the DeFi protocols in the traditional financial institutions. But when I'm dealing with our customer base, which is asset managers and investment managers, they all have their projects and they all have the flavor of blockchain per se. And interoperability is not just something that I see, I think it's an imperative. It's something that's urgent, something that we need, because at that point in time, I'm dealing with custodying an asset. It has an underlying asset that it represents, a tokenized form. I don't really care if it's an Avalanche or Solana or Ethereum or eventually Bitcoin at some point. I do want to be able to provide a service of accepting those assets. So as an asset servicing entity, I don't think you have a choice. You cannot dictate party X, party Y, because there are all kinds of exactly what you can't do today in dictating the technical standards that they maintain, whether it's email or whether it's sort of movement of SFTP files that they go into certain formats. You can agree on formats, which is industry standards. And I think that interoperability, and I've always had this multi-chain perspective that you have various different chains. There'll be no one chain that will rule them all, whether it's personal preferences, whether it's specificity that a specific asset class provides. I think those are really, really vital things for us to know. And one of the biggest things that I've been focusing on for a decade now is interoperability. Not just at the protocol level, but also ensuring that the integrity of the asset as it moves from one chain to another chain is preserved, which, as you know, is a Herculean task because the verification validation system is still closed and confined to a single chain.
So there's 2 very big things that you said there that I want to dig in on more briefly if we can. One thing was that there needs to be standards, right? So there needs to be a standard way for messages and commands and events to move across multiple chains, and that the banks and the institutions, once that standard is established, they will just use it because there's a kind of network effect there where once the most amount of counterparties use that standard, it becomes like email or FTP or just the way to transact and the way to move around that value. Does that sound right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a data standard. And so my thinking as we transition, as I'm envisioning this whole world, that you need to have a future-proofed infrastructure. So today the entire financial industry runs on messaging standards. So ISO 20022 is a payment standard.
That's
you
right.
have FIX, and you have all these ISO standards that send information about an asset as you move the asset, and you have gateways that move these messages. And as we build these new systems, it has to be dealing with the old, which is ability for them to handle messages, but they should also be able to handle tokens. And to build that system will give you that interoperability to be able to say, at the end of the day, I have to account for these assets, no matter which shape or form they come into the system or leave the system. And I think that is where the sweet spot is, that you have to have some standardized mechanism. So while we cannot agree on a protocol standards, there are standards for asset classes. How do you represent an asset in data form? Mm-hmm. And that's where I think we can put our energy in saying that the traditional finance can come into these rails or this infrastructure to be able to understand those mechanics.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think we're going to be getting rid of the old messaging systems or the old backends or even the Cobalt servers or any of this stuff. People have been trying to get rid of that for decades. They still don't have a way to get rid of it. And the only real option is to get those systems that you defined, the ISO 20022 standard or others, to interface efficiently with multiple chains. And in that efficient interfacing, you will eliminate the friction that banks and institutions have for interacting with chains.
Right.
And by eliminating that friction, you get more of that 471 trillion into the system, and then that rising tide floats all these boats.
Correct. I mean, ideally, wouldn't you all would like to collateralize your Bitcoin and be able to borrow and lend against it without going through series of USDC and providing exchanges in the system? And I think even if you look at stablecoin and eventually CBDC's conversation that we're having with 90% of global banks, these are tokenization of fiat, barring the local boundaries, and this becomes exponentially difficult when you cross border. And so many of these rails, whatever we're building, like any of the global layer 1 blockchain, are truly global systems. They are global infrastructures. So the rules of engagement for Ether holder is the same whether in Vietnam or United States, which is not the case. So ideally, I would like to envision a world where the fifth asset class, so there are 4 asset classes that generally the entire financial industry is classified into, and you have the fifth asset class, which is crypto in general. Right? And so I think ideally we should be able to learn the best of breed from both sides and be able to see where the convergence is. Because our financial system, while it's painful and it's evolved, it has to keep up with the digital times. And yeah, it's slow, but in many cases it has served the purpose until now. We need to modernize it, I think.
Yeah, I completely get what you're saying. CBDCs is another interesting topic where people have different views on it. I think the tokenization of all this stuff will to a certain degree create some governmental controls that some people may or may not like. And to another degree, it will increase the amount of value that can efficiently flow into both the traditional financial system and more importantly into the crypto system. And those CBDCs, I think, will also need to be part of this messaging standard.
Correct.
Or not part of it, but they will need to utilize something of that sense, right? And so I don't think that a messaging standard, I think it also covers treasury management, basically. It doesn't just cover the securities or the commodities industry. Basically, this messaging standard across chains, because if CBDCs all have a different chain, it's really just the same problem, right? It's how do I transact from my treasury into a commodity, out of a commodity into a security, across 5 different chains through a single messaging system that makes it simple for my back end to do that as a bank or an institution.
True. I think, so treasury, every financial institution, every corporate has to have treasury, right? And treasury interfaces with every facet of a business. Payments coming in, payments going out, accounts payable, accounts, it all hits into your overall treasury pool. The question then becomes now is you have the existing rails, the SWIFT, the ACHs, which is message based, and it has its own pluses and minuses. Mostly now it's the fact that we are far along. It was great 30 years back, but it's not great anymore because we have something better to look forward to. So how do I deal with the payment instructions coming in, but settlement happening the next day versus stable coins, the CBDC coming in and having instant settlement? So how to reconcile the velocity of movement of money which is a massive treasury challenge for if you're in banking financial institution, because at that point you need to make sure that you have healthy liquidity, which is also another concept that we need to, for a different day, different time, different stage, understand what liquidity means in crypto industry per se. So those are spot on, that it's not just about tokenizing the world and moving it on the rails. These are true business challenges. And we haven't even talked about taxes and accounting, because you still have to do that in the real world at some point, right? So.
Yeah, makes sense. Great, so I think we're on the same page. All the stuff you said about messaging and then that I said, that's what we're working on with CCIP, to make sure that you can have a single messaging standard.
That's right.
With one interface to all the chains, whether it's commodity, security, or a treasury related thing, so that you can do that through one messaging system.
Just brace yourself. I was much younger when I took on this job. Look what happened to me.
I know what you mean, man. Believe me. The other thing that you mentioned that's very interesting is about proving things. So the thing that we were discussing briefly before the cross-chain question, which I think is a fundamental question, right? Because banks are not going to live on any one chain. They're going to have to transact with hundreds of chains because different geographies, different counterparties, different settlement systems, so on and so on. But then even as you transact with those other chains, you constantly need to prove things to them.
That's right.
Right? Because once again, the chains, they don't know what the NAV of something is. They don't know what the valuation is. They don't know what the state of an asset is. They don't know, what the proof of reserve status is. And so in addition to transitioning all the information between the chains and allowing you to basically move things between them, as you move things between them, would you say that it's important to keep those records consistently updated about things outside of each of those chains, right? Is that a critical component of the...
No, 100%. In fact, I think the reason why you have delay in movement of asset is because consistency. Consistency is sort of the hallmark of the industry, to ensure that two books are consistent before the asset can take the next hop. They have to reconcile on these things. And I would also say, if you're referring to proof of reserve, is that where you're going with this?
That's what I'm referring to.
So the thing is, I built a payment system in 2019. It was meant to do both, send messages and send stable coins. And we're working with a Nevada-based entity, where we looked into this saying, hey, we do need to provide this reserve, because again, we're working with, as a technology company, we are working with banks, so we had to do everything in a regulated form or fashion. And you had to hire one of the expensive audit firms to do these audits. We had to do that. We had no choice, because again, we're dealing with regulated institutions. So at the time, we didn't have the term proof of reserve, and the same entity eventually hired the Adrenio sort of entity to be able to provide this quote-unquote proof of reserve for their stablecoin ecosystem. But proof of reserve is the hallmark of this fragmentation that exists today. The fact that you have the various different entities who are either accounting for your asset, or who are watching for your asset, or custodying your asset, at the end of the day, they vouch for it. And that vouching essentially is saying, I have the proof of reserve. So when we digitize these things, this is what I was saying, that you'll have new intermediaries, that you have newer proof of reserve entities who will say, now that I've tokenized these assets, I've tokenized fiat, I've tokenized stablecoin, and CBDCs, and you have tokenized, let's say, existing real-world assets. Now, do I rely on the same audit firms? And if all they're doing is scraping the chain and giving us the information, can I not automate those functions and provide a mechanism where suddenly now I can trust the system that there is proof of reserve, and I don't have any collusion, which is what happened in many of the fraudulent activities, I think.
Right, because the audit firms do it on an annual basis, and the proof of reserve automated system can do it on a second-by-second basis,
right.
First of all. And second of all, who knows what's going on there?
Or it can be event-based. Every time you move an asset.
Could be anything you want based.
Yeah.
And so do you see Oracle Networks as that possible agent that's going to process all that?
So I think POR is more valuable to me than your initial vision of what you had with oracles. Even though I think proof of reserve is part of an oracle, but you're relying on that oracle, and the oracle does provide the reference from all these areas. And the fact that you have multiple chains, you would need some sort of an interface that doesn't, that provides that. Technically, it sounds very choppy, but I think in many cases, if you have the right protocols in place, that's doable. But I don't really care which chain you're on. And I think taking a page from Circle USDC, they didn't even care about solving the interoperability between chains. They said, we are the issuer, you redeem the asset with us, we'll provide an API, and we'll issue the asset on all these supported chains. So if you want to move an asset from Polkadot to Stellar, you can use an API, I'll burn the token here and issue the token here, so I still maintain that consistent reserve that I have. I think that's just easier than fighting the interoperability challenge for that. So these abstractions, the interfaces, I think is a near-term solution. Then we achieve the true interoperability of asset, because I think one that's untenable near-term because technology is not there yet. But I think having interfaces will give us an avenue that, as long as I can trust the interface, I should be able to provide that asset, a certainty of availability of that asset, which is what reserves would be.
Right, makes sense. So instead of just trusting an institution, if the interface to a proof of reserve system was clear and simple enough, then that could create additional risk management for you.
Sure.
It could just prove and reduce the risk and allow you to settle faster.
Not just that, but if you look at any of the swim lanes of this financial institution, that when an asset moves, it has to update, which is where consistency comes into play. Accounting system, tax systems, it has to update your book of records, your investment book of records. All these updates today happen through complex sort of messaging systems. So if I'm dealing on polling, event-based management, then I have real-time visibility of these assets, which has a whole new opportunities space, especially in terms of how we manage our collateral, how we borrow and lend, for instance. So I call them financial primitives. So these are basics of money. You either save money, or you spend money, or you borrow money, you lend money. So these are primitives that the entire products that the industry relies upon is built upon these borrowing and lending and collateral type models.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So I think what we're saying is blockchains are great. They allow quicker and more efficient settlement. In order for them to really, really take hold in capital markets, they need to get connected, because value is going to have to move across them to provide real value to that industry. And then in addition, as they get connected, as all the assets move and all the financial products interact with each other across chains, there's going to be a need to keep everything updated. Because if you don't keep everything updated, then you're not going to get the benefits of the consistency and the speed that you get from the blockchain, right? So you don't just need a blockchain, you need connectivity, and you need to keep everything in the blockchain updated in order for it to have that speed and consistency, basically the value to the capital markets.
There's no way I can not agree with that. I agree. I think the whole thing is you do have these, what I say that blockchain is solving the issue of two constructs, time and trust. Time is sense of immediacy, so this whole notion of two-pronged systems or multilateral systems that build. So in this case, and the trust is the fact you have so many trust intermediaries. Can we trust the trust protocols that provide the same level of trust? Or maybe some digital intermediaries. And we've always compared this moniker of what internet has done for information, blockchain will do for things of value. If you look at it, that information networks removed information intermediaries. No one goes to travel agents anymore, but you do go to any of the n number of travel websites, but they give you more than just booking a ticket. They give you a travel experience, they curate your whole thing, they give you one-stop shop, but they're still digital intermediaries. And I envision that world in some form of fashion. So that's the transformation agenda for large financial institutions to say, we have the practice, we have the discipline, we have the risk models. Can we not digitize these things and provide that as a service and extend that model? So it's less about fighting crypto, but it's more about adopting what we can do from adopting the tech and making the system better.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think it's just making everything more secure and automated, because the encryption guarantees and the reliability guarantees of blockchains and smart contracts and oracles allow you to do that, right? You basically get to a place where you don't need people to triple check everything and you need to wait 3 days for the other system. Everything just gets signed, oracles verify a few things, blockchains, do enough confirmations, and you can settle things out in a couple of minutes or seconds instead of a couple of days. And therefore you don't need a travel agent anymore. You just have everything in a reliable technical interface.
And every intermediary, every information intermediary that was between you and the green screen is gone at the end of the day, because we've taken that interface, moved on to web, given you a better UI, UX.
Right.
That is not up to standard of the newer model, the Web 3.0 conversation we're having. It was good it has evolved over the past 3 or 4 decades of that UI UX piece. So, and I've learned one thing. I'm not going to disagree with you on the stage. I've seen you angry, Sergey. There's no way I'm sure you have seen that too. Not a public spectacle of that here. I'm just kidding, of course.
Yeah, it's fine. Look, I just really care about this stuff, and I've been spending every waking moment on it for the past couple of years. And so, and I'm also not a super duper patient person. I need things to happen because we have to get going. And
you should work for a bank for some time and see how.
No, I could not. I would not survive in a large structure.
Just do the internship. Come on.
I couldn't.
3 months.
I would never.
Hang with me. We'll figure it out.
I would never make it. I would go straight to the guy at the top. I would show him a diagram, and I would say, we need to eliminate this.
It'll take you 3 months to figure out who the guy at the top is.
It wouldn't take me 3 months. It might take me like a week to figure out how to get to him through security, but I get to him and he'd have a meeting with me somehow, and then I would be fired.
It's not that bad.
I would be fired
with the same goal.
But luckily for me, you guys do that, so I don't have to. And so all I have to do is provide the technology, and everything can work. But yeah, I completely agree with what you're saying. I think that all of this will really just become one thing, and the travel agents, I think they do have a place in it if they start a travel website, right? So I think everybody in the capital markets has a place in this cryptographically guaranteed world. It's just like the internet, right? If you ignored the internet, you didn't do so well, and maybe you even closed down. And if you went from being something that was brick and mortar and you started a website, you did even better than before.
Yeah.
So I think it's really the same type of choice.
Absolutely. And I started this journey in 2012, 2013, where we were told, don't mention Bitcoin in any of your blockchain conversations. And I'm like, how the hell do you do that? How do you hell not mention Bitcoin when you talk about blockchain per se? And now we are, and the beauty of where we are today is that it's no longer about financial institution versus crypto. It's every financial institution got to compete themselves in the same tech. So to me, the conversation we're having in Congress, MICA, the regulatory framework around this, every financial institution making, and we have Franklin Templeton sort of both here, that was never seen before for an institution to come here. I think all this is progress, and it'll take some time, maybe not at your speed. We do have something called regulation that we have to get approval from, a little small thing, but it's progress. We should celebrate that.
I definitely feel the progress, and I really appreciate you coming on stage and
thank you.
Working on this for so many years. And I'm excited to see the global financial system become better. And I think that's at the end of the day what everyone wants. And I want to thank you for sharing your views today with us.
Thank you, and congrats on all your achievements with Oracle.
Thank you.
Thank you.